Hi, everyone. We're so excited to welcome you to the first webinar in our People Fundamentals series, Responding to the Great Resignation and Shaping the Future of Work. My name is Samira Iyengar, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. All attendees are in view-only mode. Please submit any questions in the Q&A window at the right of your screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and all attendees will receive the replay of this video. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host speaker, Sue Van Klink, our strategic advisor here at Betterworks.
Thank you, Sabina. And hello, everyone. We're super excited that you could join us here today. We are very fortunate and privileged to have Dr. Anthony Klotz join us to talk about a phenomena that he coined the term for the Great Resignation and what it means to our organizations and how we might want to address the things that he sees in his work at the UCL School of Management in London. He studies employee performance, work design, and the psychology of quitting, and as I said, predicted the Great Resignation. His research on resignations has been published in top management journals, and his insights from this research has been featured in the Harvard Business Review and the Wall Street Journal. Anthony recently moved to East London about 3 months ago and is the proud new parent of 2 rescue kittens. And we're super excited to have you join us today. Welcome, Dr. Anthony Klotz.
Thank you so much, Sue. It's wonderful to be here today and to join all of you and talk about this moment in the world of work. And it is a fairly unique moment in the world of work with what we've been through over the past few years and where we're at right now. And the theme of the discussion today, I think, is going to be that this is a wonderful moment of opportunity. It's been a couple difficult years for managers since 2020 and the pandemic and the challenges that it brought. And now we're a little bit past that. And we're in this moment where the world of work is unsettled. And although it's a stressful moment and there's a bit of change fatigue out there, the good news is that some of the best times to push through organizational change is when individuals are already a little bit unsettled and open to some experimentation and some new ways of thinking. And so in the brief time we have together today, I'll talk a little bit about where we've been, but more importantly, focus on where we're going in the world of work and how organizations can respond to this moment, can step up in this moment to make the world of work a better place and a more sustainable place. So backing up a few years, how did we get to this moment? And part of it is what were the causes of the Great Resignation and why was it such a challenge for organizations to respond? And really it's because the Great Resignation, the drivers of it were so multifaceted, and you had a number of different elements driving turnover. And so there was not one easy solution that organizations could focus on. First, from a very basic standpoint, there was moving into 2020, there was a large backlog of resignations in the economy. And so 2020 was a year in which relatively few individuals quit. And so once the pandemic started to end in terms of the vaccines coming online, a number of individuals enacted their plans to leave that they had made a year ago, which created this really tight labor market. And then these other forces were layered on top of it, really high levels of burnout. If I could ask you to raise your hand to say, did you experience a little bit of higher stress, burnout over the past couple of years? There'd probably be a lot of hands up in the air out there. And what was interesting and unique about this moment of high levels of burnout is that it wasn't just the frontline workers who got us through the pandemic that were burnt out. It was also individuals who educated their children full-time while working full-time from home during that period of time. It was many of you, HR professionals, who were managing through the pandemic. And so I knew that because of these high levels of burnout, a number of individuals would simply need to change their situation, which would escalate the number of resignations that were in the economy. We also had the pandemic was unique in that it was a public health crisis. And many of us, when we experience a health threat, start to reassess our lives a little bit. And you might have heard the term pandemic epiphanies. And so many of your workers were not only experiencing some of the burnout that went along with the pandemic, but also taking a step back and reflecting on their lives and saying, is my life the life that I want to live? And if not, where is that lack of meaning? Where is that lack of satisfaction coming from? And so as professionals, as HR managers, as leaders, many of us had to deal with employees who were asking these existential questions. It was as though millions of us had a quarter life crisis at the same time. And then finally, there was remote work. The future of work brought into the present, probably by about 20 years, and maybe the grandest experiment that's ever gone on in the history of work, having millions of individuals switch to remote work. And it wasn't an easy adjustment. Many of us struggled to adjust and be productive while working remotely from home and often educating children at the same time. But we did it. And just like when you send expatriates abroad, once we got through the culture shock of working remotely, many individuals enjoyed it. And that's not surprising because remote work provides more autonomy to individuals often than working in the office does. And so you had this situation where maybe half of our workforce was able to work remotely and experience that autonomy. And the other half of the workforce that was working in person wasn't able to access that. So it was almost though there was this built-in inequity in the workforce. There's some economists, Nick Bloom is one of the leading ones at Stanford, who has estimated that working remotely is equivalent to a 6% raise in pay. That's what workers value it at, 6%. And so you can imagine that when half of the workforce was able to work remotely, that was almost like half the workforce got a 6% raise in pay. And the other half was saying, what about us? So these different forces that I just mentioned were all coming together at the same time and leading us to a situation of unprecedented turnover. But it's important to keep in mind how unprecedented this actually is. And for that, I'm going to pull up a few graphs just to give individuals the context of the Great Resignation and how much turnover there was or was not. So let's look at it by the numbers. And so the slide I have pulled up here on the screen, if you look at the y-axis, this is simply in the United States, the percentage of workers who voluntarily leave their jobs in a given month, the percent of the workforce. 2019, which is what you see on the screen, it was about 2.3 or 2.4% every month. That's the percent of the US workforce that quit their jobs. Now, importantly, 2019 is a great baseline because it was the highest year for resignations on record, even though records have only been kept since 2000. So over the last 2 decades, 2019 was the highest year. So let's look at that, see what happens to this in 2020 and why that backlog of resignations existed. 2020 was the year of the pandemic, along with other big events, especially in the US economy. And you see resignations drop way down to like 1.6% of the workforce. But then by the end of the year, had largely recovered. And that's why there was this belief that we were going to start getting back to normal as the vaccines came online. But we didn't go back to normal. Keeping 2019 as a base rate and moving forward to 2021, we see that quits just kept going up. And this is a visual depiction of what the Great Resignation really was. And I'll leave it up to you to say how great was it. But we, instead of being at 2.4, which was the highest on record, the percentage of the US economy that was leaving their jobs jumped by 25%, up to 3% per month. And so if you thought to yourself, a lot of my employees were turning over relative even to 2019, this bears that out. Now, importantly, I always get the question, is the Great Resignation still going on? And if we fast forward this chart just ahead, both lines by 6 months and come up to the most recent numbers, which are July, you can see the resignation rates in the US have largely plateaued and even dipped a little bit. And so my answer is usually, the nice thing is resignations are continuing to go up. It looks like we've plateaued. And finally, it's important to keep this in historical context. A lot of individuals felt like the events of 2020 fundamentally changed workers' relationship with work. If we back up to a decade of resignations, this tells a little bit of a different story. What this suggests is the rate of resignations, in this case, it's the number of resignations, has been increasing every year over the last decade. Right here in 2012, that number is 2 million. And you see it jumped all the way to 4.5 million in 2021. And so again, if you're thinking, it seems like employees quit more often than they did 10 years ago. Yeah, they're quitting at twice the rate. Now, I do also want to call your attention to the far right end of the chart and say this is the moment that we're in, where I think the worst of the Great Resignation has hit, and you start to see the numbers come back down. And I think there's a debate right now. Are those numbers coming down because the economy is faltering a little bit? In my conversations with organizational leaders, I don't think it's being driven by the economy. I think it's being driven by a lot of organizations responding to the labor market over the past year and a half, responding by increasing pay, increasing benefits, and developing stronger relationships with their employees, and starting to figure out this post-pandemic workplace. And so I'll just move ahead to one more chart, which just takes this chart and moves it to the rates, since we've been working in rates, and say it shows this same sort of opportunity here, that the rate of resignations has started to come down a bit, perhaps for the first time in the last 10 years. And so there is this opportunity, and I'll move to talking about that now, where we can think about these causes of the Great Resignation and say, how do we design solutions for them? Not only such that it stops the Great Resignation or we plateau, but that we can really build up employer relationships such that this continues to go back down, perhaps below the rates it was in 2019, 2018, 2017, and so forth. And so that's what I mean when I say we're in this moment of a great opportunity. The opportunity is there to forge these stronger relationships with employees, but organizations and organizational leaders have to take that first step. And so what does that first step look like? Well, a lot of it is taking a look at just the overall opportunity that we have here and saying, a lot of this, a lot of the talk about the future of work has to do with remote work, and that's an important part of it. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to one-on-one relationships with employees. And when I talk to HR managers and say, besides the burnout, how are you feeling right now? A lot of them say, look, the workplace of 2019 was not great. It was dysfunctional in a number of ways. If you remember back in 2018 and 2019, all of the realizations around harassment in the workplace, about inequity in the workplace, the sort of glorification of hustle culture, that we really have this seat at the table right now to really develop stronger relationships with employees. And it all starts with a lot of one-on-one communication. But if you think about, we have an increased rate of resignations right now. How do we deal with it? What I've seen from organizations is one of the first steps is looking more deeply into the resignation process. In many ways, resignations have been the least paid attention to aspect of the employee life cycle. And for good reason. When an employee is voluntarily leaving, it's not something that we want to celebrate or stare at for too long, especially when it's a high performer leaving. It can be quite painful. But organizations are doing just that. They're saying, we've invested so much in our onboarding programs over the years, and we've completely neglected our offboarding programs. And we're going to change that. And they're changing it in ways, everything from when an employee quits, making sure that the manager manages that exit properly, and also meets and sits down with each of the remaining employees and sees how they're feeling in the wake of their coworker leaving. Because turnover contagion is real. One employee leaving puts the thought in other employees' minds that could be something to explore. And so taking action right away to stop that turnover contagion. At the same time, once upon a time, it was an act of betrayal to leave the organization. Of course, savvy HR departments have now realized that often when employees leave, they realize the grass isn't greener than they thought it was, and there's an opportunity to bring those employees back as boomerang employees. There's estimates right now, and I probably don't have to tell you, that 25 to 30% of new hires right now are actually old hires. They're actually boomerang hires, bringing employees back. You might have seen headlines that say the Great Resignation, more like the Great Regret. Up to 25 or 30% of employees wish they hadn't left their jobs. So companies are saying one of our best new recruitment pools are former employees. I talked to one organization that went so far as when a high performer leaves, they don't necessarily accept the resignation. They say, we'll give you a 1-year leave of absence, and we'll check in with you every couple months and just see if the grass is greener. And if not, you can come on back because we've instituted this leave of absence and we're right here waiting for you. So not forgetting about the loyal employees, but also keeping in touch and building relationships with employees as they leave. I also talked about burnout, and mental well-being is everywhere in the headlines. And we're starting to get into these conversations about how to create a sustainable workplace in terms of employee well-being. I'm sure almost everyone in the audience has heard the term quiet quitting over the past few weeks. I've commented on a few times, and it always elicits a really strong reaction. But at the core is this conversation about where the boundaries of my job are. And does my HR manager, my manager, and myself have agreement on what I'm being paid to do and what is above and beyond? And if I go above and beyond, what happens? Because we have lots of research that shows going above and beyond can be very rewarding for employees. It's good for their career, but it also contributes to burnout. And so this quiet quitting conversation, even though it's been largely unpleasant, is an important one that has surfaced. The other thing that has surfaced is a time-tested cure for burnout, and that's psychological detachment from work. Actually making sure that when your employees go home in the evening, or when you go home in the evening or on vacation, that you actually take a mental break from work. You leave your work identity behind. And so experimenting with ways that employees can actually detach from work at the end of the day or on the weekend or on vacation to fully facilitate recovery processes so that they're replenished when they come back to the office. What's also become clear, as I talked about earlier, is individuals right now are in the midst of reevaluating their life. And you keep hearing the comment that before the pandemic, I would arrange my life to fit around work. And after the pandemic, I want work to fit around my life. And so we're moving into these important conversations about how do we do that? I saw a statistic today that was a survey of organizations that said, how much more are you using part-time work now than you did before the pandemic? And it was up like 25%. And so organizations are really thinking about, okay, we want to make sure that employees can have a rich life outside of work, but we still want them to bring their best to work. And so how do we sit down with them, connect with each individual and say, how do we find that mix that's reasonable for you and for us? And then finally, there's flexible working. And in many ways, I hope, or I think we've moved past sort of the boring conversation of remote work good, in-person bad, hybrid good, remote bad, these sorts of conversations. And I like to think we're returning a little bit to the job analysis, like breaking down an employee's job and saying, what elements of this job can be performed remotely or in person at a high level? One thing we've realized is that when it comes to onboarding, it's really difficult to do well remotely. And so many organizations have said, until we figure out a better way to do this, onboarding is an activity we need to do in person. There's a number of companies that have found that certain innovation processes don't work as well remotely. And so while we try to find solutions to do that, let's make sure that we do it in person. And finally, if there's employees who have a lot of like head down, deep thinking work, where do we find space for them to do that? Perhaps at home, but that might not be a good spot. So let's make sure that there's not open office concepts, but there's places where they can do deep work. So again, really breaking down employees' jobs instead of saying we should go hybrid or we should just go remote, thinking about what makes the most sense. And by the way, if you do that, you can offer a much more compelling case to employees for why they need to come back to the office for 2, 3, 5 days a week. Because look, we sort of broke the job down, and here's where people do their best work. So obviously easier said than done, but as some of those examples hopefully illustrate, we're in this wonderful moment of experimentation, a moment in which we can probably ask ourselves, how do we actually strengthen the connections with employees while embracing the future of work? And it's not going to be easy, but it does involve one-on-one connections and saying, how do we make sure that employees and their managers connect? And in the section of this session that comes next, the Q&A, we'll talk a little bit more about that manager-employee connection and some of the ways to strengthen it.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony. Some incredible comments in there. I've taken a page full of notes, and what I think I was most interested to hear is that this viewpoint that the resignation rate is dropping off, not necessarily because of some of the murmurs that are in the economy, but more because companies are making intent choices and decisions around how they've responded to the Great Resignation, increasing pay, increasing benefits, figuring out this new world of work, designing for, sort of on-premise, remote, hybrid work, and so on. And what I see a lot of is bringing more meaning to the work that people are doing, and really trying to connect people to purpose and having a reason why what they do for the company they do it for really matters and is something to be proud of. And so that's certainly something that we see as well. You mentioned right at the end about the role that the manager plays in the Great Resignation and creating a sense of connection and having conversations with their employees. And I saw something in one of the articles you published about how listening is more important than speaking when you have those conversations with your employees. Can you tell us a little bit about what companies are doing to get a more accurate picture of the employee-manager relationship, why it's so vital to the performance of the company, and maybe why it's so hard to get a gauge of that or a sense of that? Any thoughts there?
Yes. So when it comes to the employee-manager relationship, some of the highest performing organizations are doing is investing more in management and trying to create more space for HR to meet with managers and say, do you have the tools that you need to manage these individuals? And I know that's not a very sophisticated response, but the reality is that a lot of managers' spans of controls have just gotten too big for them to be effective. And so there's part of what's going on is the realization that we probably need to shrink the span of controls back down and revisiting, like, what are managers doing with their day that they don't seem to be spending as much time and energy building relationships as we'd like them to. And that's not the manager's fault. It's the nature of the middle manager role, of the manager role itself. And so what we see companies doing is saying, okay, our spans of control are probably a bit too big, because really what you want is, when I say employees are rethinking their relationship with work, the most important relationship that they have that colors their relationship with work is with their direct supervisor. And if you think about the most important relationships in your life, and maybe with your best friend, with your partner, with a child, it takes a lot of work to maintain that relationship, right? And so in many cases, we're asking managers, can you maintain 15 of those while you also have these operational requirements at the same time? And we've done a lot of research that's shown, and this probably happens in our personal relationships too, if we have a bunch of operational tasks to get done, And if we get those done, the firefighting pile goes down. Or we can invest in relationships. And the payoff for investing in relationships doesn't happen right away. There's no immediate ping of like, yes, I got that done. We tend to direct our attention to the big pile of operational tasks. And so it is really sitting down and saying, how much have we placed on our managers' plates, the tasks versus the people? And in many cases, it's weighted too much on the tasks. And there was a recent study that came out, like one of the most important elements when it comes to driving employees to quit is unfair treatment. When all of us are treated unfairly, we have a very strong reaction to that. And so one of the causes of turnover is an event that happens to us that is unfair. And so often those unfair decisions come from our direct manager. And so there was recently a study done that simply asked the question, why do managers make so many unfair decisions? And they asked managers, do you not value fair treatment? And they did it in a scientifically valid way. And the managers scored very high in terms of valuing unfair treatment. And what the researchers found was really simple, that managers highly valued treating people fair, but because they had so many tasks on their plate, they didn't make time to make fair decisions and think about how the decisions that they were making would be viewed unfair by their employees. And so that's a long way of saying, I think we're in a moment where organizations need to think about, are we investing enough in our middle managers to give them the time to do the people side of their job well, to build those 5 or 10 one-on-one relationships in a very strong way? If not, then it's going to be difficult to build a strong social fabric in your organization.
I couldn't agree more, Anthony. And in fact, I think that there is a belief that a manager should have no more people than that they can handle, sort of a weekly one-on-one with, in addition to doing the work that needs to get done. And I think that's something, as we design for the future of work, understanding how many people a manager can manage well and how to, sort of build that into the framework is important. Let's shift gears a little bit towards change fatigue, because that's certainly something that's come up as the, sort of the reason for turnover and burnout. And that's really this idea that, we have been under so much pressure to deal with so much change in the last few years. And it's really opened us up, I think, to rethink things and to rethink our approach. So that is a benefit, certainly, to many. But what would you say in terms of how do we as people and we as HR leaders and as executives, sort of manage the pace of change and this change fatigue, other than, I love the idea of psychological detachment. My husband and I are about to go on our honeymoon. I'm going to use that term with him as we head out the door on a week's vacation. That I would love to be a true psychological detachment from work for both of us. What else can we do to manage change fatigue?
Yes. So, change fatigue is real. And even though, Joe Biden told us last week that the pandemic is over, the infodemic is not over. It seems like it's just one event after the next that's disruptive in our personal lives and professional lives. But what's interesting about the last couple of years is the boundaries between our personal lives and our professional lives and our workers, 2 domains, have really dropped. And so what that means is when something happens outside of work, and it could be something good, but often it's something negative that affects workers, they bring those effects into work, and it affects how they feel and so forth. It used to be that we would just expect workers to sort of check their emotions at the door. And that doesn't happen anymore, especially when we're working in remote settings. And so this can be really depleting for HR professionals and managers to manage. And the first thing I would say is it's important to, psychological safety is important. And so creating an environment where employees feel like they can share with their managers how they're feeling about what's going on outside of work. We know it's problematic when individuals have to act at work. And all of us engage in some level of surface acting in the workplace. But creating a psychologically safe work environment is vital, so that if an employee has something that happens to them outside of work that affects them at work, they're able to bring it in. But in many cases, what we're finding is because of all of the negative news that's coming our way, we've gotten in sort of a rut of just waiting for the next shoe to drop. What's the next bad thing that's going to happen? And that is a really unhealthy mindset for us as individuals and for us as workers as well. And so now is really the moment for leaders to get back to painting that positive vision of the future, vision-based leadership, purpose-based leadership, and creating a positive momentum again. Because most of us did get knocked back a little bit during the past couple of years. And employees aren't just looking for meaning in their work. That's definitely important, but they're also looking for that brighter future. And so I don't think you necessarily need to be reactive to each event that happens outside of work. I think you need to know employees well enough to know which will be affected by those different events. But it's important to also really start focusing again on the future and sort of the positive purpose of the organization.
And it's so interesting when we talk about the manager as the front line to sharing positivity with the employees and addressing difficulties as they come up in the broader environment. I can remember certainly as a leader myself, feeling the need to reach out to my direct employees and my broader team with messages of, are you okay? Are you okay with what's going on in the world today for whatever event happened to be happening? But then, of course, leaning back into how we drive results, how we can help in the world, right? So what can our response be to some of those events that are going on, whether it's fundraising for disaster relief, or whether it's marching for equality, or whatever it might be? How do we come together as a team and help make a difference in the world, which is something that people seem to be looking for. And we do get so much doom and gloom, but one of the things that you said at the beginning of your talk is there are actually some bright spots that are out there, and how can we remind people about the bright spots, and how can we as leaders lean in around the bright spots? Are there things that you can share or remind us of, Anthony, that we can take back to our organizations of, hey, the sky isn't necessarily falling, things are moving in the right direction, we do have a great opportunity in front of us? What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, I would start by pointing out, that those plateauing and dropping resignation numbers that we already talked about, but and just broadly, that this should be a time of optimism for the world of work. And it was interesting. I was being interviewed for a story the other day, and the story was about, why does work seem so dysfunctional right now? Is it more dysfunctional than ever? And my response was certainly not. I mean, I would say, yes, there's a lot of issues with it. But a lot of the tools to deal with those issues we just need to figure out how to use them properly. And that's going to be a several year experiment where we're trying to figure out what's the right ways to work. But there is this brighter future in store. And it was interesting when that story came out, they interviewed another professor who said the exact same thing. And I've talked to so many HR professionals, in that 10-year chart sort of shows these HR professionals that said, look, the pandemic didn't bring up really many new issues. It just sort of caused them to go to the front burner because of all the turnover and stress that was caused. But these are things we've been talking about for a decade, that the amount of hustle culture, and that we're overworking employees, harassment, bias in the workplace, non-inclusive cultures, those were issues that were really important in 2019. And now because of the pandemic, we're really face to face with them. But then again, we have some of the tools to deal with it. And I enjoy almost every day when I look at the news, there's stories of companies experimenting with new ways of working that never would have happened had the last 2 years of disruption not happened. And so I don't know what anybody will think of this example, but I saw on the BBC the other day that Citi, the bank, they have investment bankers in New York and London who work a lot of hours and get paid a lot of money. And they're running an experiment where they're opening an investment banking office in Malaga, Spain, and paying individuals a little bit less, but limiting their investment bankers to 40 hours a week and lower pay. Now, I'm not an investment banking expert. I don't know if that experiment's going to work, but I just love the idea of these recruits who want to go into investment banking getting the choice of two paths: the high pay burnout path, or the path where you can do what you love, investment banking, but work less and maybe not make as many financial rewards. And so again, if I could ask everybody in the room, I'd be interested what you thought about that. But the point is, these are experiments that simply would not have happened a couple of years ago. And once the results from these experiments continue to come in, these organizations are going to find ways of working that lead to higher well-being for employees, that strengthen the relationship between employees and their work. And I'm just really excited about that. That being said, we are in this experimenting stage, and it can be a little bit uncertain and uncomfortable, but the future is bright.
Couldn't agree more. And I think, we are in the uncomfortable middle as we figure this all out, but with great adversity comes great opportunity for change. And I think we're seeing that as well. One of the things that we see at Betterworks, and one of the reasons why HR leaders and executives come to us, is they're looking for tools to better connect employees with their managers, to make conversations easier, to capture, conversations in the flow of work and things like that. What have you seen in your research, Anthony, around technology and the role that technology plays in helping solve for some of these problems, especially as we look at different models of working and the future of work and things like that? What are your thoughts around what technology can do for us here?
Yeah, so I think technology can play a number of roles. I've said a few different times that managers are probably overburdened with a lot of the operational side of work, and that would probably go for HR managers as well. And so some of the advances that we're seeing in HR analytics and some of the technology that's coming online, such that managers can understand how their employees are feeling in the moment and over time, I think is really helping out the workplace. And so I don't think you can substitute for spending one-on-one time with subordinates and strengthening that relationship. And so the nice thing is technology is facilitating not only a lot of the operational tasks, but a lot of the quantitative elements of HR. And something as simple as pulse surveys. They give managers an idea of how employees are feeling in the moment, and if there's a trouble spot, or for managers who have to do the annual performance appraisal, which the annual performance appraisal is one of the few things that managers and subordinates dislike at an equally high level for a number of reasons. But having data collection tools that make performance reviews, whether they're quarterly, annual, or weekly, more accurate and take the bias out of them, removing stressors for employees and managers that way. Those are just win-wins. And so I think technology has a key role, and I love the rise of HR analytics and data analytics and the role they play, as long as it frees managers up to invest more in their relationships with their employees.
Couldn't agree more. One of our most recent surveys produced the result that managers spend over 5 weeks of their time in some of these HR processes. And that is too much time for the value that those processes deliver. They're important, but it needs to be simpler. It needs to be easier. It needs to be seamless. We're going to move now to some of the questions that have been put into the Q&A and field questions from the audience. I don't want to hog all of your time. So for anyone that has a question that you haven't answered yet, put into the Q&A. If we don't get up to all of them, and we probably won't, given that we've got about 15 minutes left before Sabina wraps us up, we will send out answers to all the questions with the follow-up of this presentation. So lots of comments, lots of questions about, sort of how do we really do this? And one of the questions that strikes me is we're losing people to remote opportunities. We've got situations where hybrid or remote work can't work for all of our workforce. And any other ideas on how to offer more flexible work arrangements aside from the remote hybrid work? Any thoughts there, Anthony?
Yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind when it comes to remote work. I mentioned people's need for autonomy, but also one of individuals' like fundamental human needs is need for connectedness as well. And so in-person work has its own set of benefits when it comes to satisfying fundamental needs. But I think this question brings up a great point that flexibility and remote don't equal one another. Like remote is just one way to increase flexibility in employees' work. And so, of course, if you're working in a system with a union contract, there are constraints on what you can do here. But I would ask your in-person workers, what does a more flexible job look like to you? If we can just take working from home off the table for a moment, or working from anywhere off the table for a moment, what would create more flexibility for you? And they may come up with something as simple as like, a 4-day work week or working half days on Friday. But you may find that it's like, we would like more notice before the schedule changes, or I'd like to be able to work 2 hours on Saturday and flex that with Wednesday. I was talking to one large organization that, and I think a number of large organizations are competing with gig work and employees. They're losing employees to gig work. And so it's like, how do we offer systems for our in-person workers that are a little more gig work? Like if our minimum shift that we want employees to work is, say, 6 hours, is there a reason that it's 6 hours? Could it be 4 hours? Could it be 2 hours? Could we let people pick up smaller chunks of time? And so I think it's useful when you think about in-person work flexibility to just forget about remote for a second and say, let's think. And often we're more creative when there's constraints put on our creativity and the problem we're trying to solve, and say, so what does really flexible in-person work look like? And I do think we're moving into a period of time when there is going to be higher quality and more part-time work offered. It could be in-person work, let's say manufacturing line workers who have a sabbatical option built into their careers. So really thinking outside the box in terms of how to make in-person work flexible.
Great suggestions. And I agree. Thinking of that, like, how do we ask people what would make in-person work more flexible for them is a great place to start. Next question from Roxana really has to do with one of the things I think you're seeing in your research is a higher rate of Gen Z and millennials resigning. And her question is, do you think youngism in the workplace could be one of those reasons, or what reasons are we seeing that the younger generation seem to be voting with their feet a little bit more than the older generations might be? Is that true?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, it's important to keep in mind that if we went back 50 years, young workers turn over at higher rates than older workers because they're in more entry-level early jobs. And so it does seem somewhat harder to retain. Now, some recent survey data, which is sort of shocking a lot of people, has shown that actually it's these younger generations of workers that have a higher preference for in-person work than older generations of workers. And the highest percentage of individuals, the highest generation that wants to work remotely is actually the older generations. And so I think it's some of these, and this might have to do with youngism, some of these assumptions about younger workers just don't really hold up to a lot of scrutiny. You hear a lot of these workers saying, I want in person because I'm early in my career. And it goes back to that onboarding comment that I made earlier. Early in your career, it's hard to make up for some of the in-person connection that you can make as you start your career in certain industries. And so I think it's important for organizations. If you're a large organization, you have the benefit of being able to sort of talk to your younger employees and ask what their preferences are. But I do think almost, one of the first questions I always get in any interview I do is this a younger generation piece that's driving it? And because younger people disproportionately make up high turnover industries like retail and food service and so forth, it can look like this is the Great Resignation is a younger person's thing. But I can't, but what's interesting is early retirement has been off the charts high for the last few years, which isn't the same as resignation, but you can draw a connection there. So I don't think anything good comes from making sweeping assumptions. And I think you're sort of hinting at that with this youngism comment that that's what people are doing, is saying these younger generations are this and that. But the evidence that we are seeing is these younger generations are fairly committed and want to be in person at a high rate. And I think, again, part of the exciting aspect of some of the remote work options that now exist is you can imagine it's easier to retain employees if you have flexibility around how they work. So you can imagine that an employee early in their career wants to work in person. And then maybe they have a child or two and they say, I want to work a little bit more hybrid. And then when their kids go off to college and it's empty nests, they want to become digital nomads. Now, it used to be they would have to leave the organization to do that, especially for large organizations or for work that can be made remote. We can actually retain people over the course of their career and have longer term relationships with them if you're flexible enough for that.
It's a great point. My husband works for one of the big four accounting firms, and they have instituted a work your way policy where you get to decide if you want to be on site with clients or if you want to be virtual with client work. And they match up, sort of the client with the worker based on that dynamic, which never existed before. That's net new in the last 2 years. This idea that you could work for a big four accountancy firm and not have to go on site with clients travels 75% of your time. So they're trying to get creative as well. I'm going to ask another question in the few minutes that we have left about a very specific case, which is healthcare. And you would think if we talk about purpose and meaning at work, that there's no greater sense of that than in healthcare, and certainly in the last couple of years. And I certainly see a lot of young people choosing to become, sort of a medical staff of some kind and go into the hospital system. But I think we're equally seeing, or even more, seeing people leaving the hospital system. And that is potentially because of the short staff situation that exists, which is exacerbating that burnout and the overwork and being asked to do more with less. Any suggestion for any of our HR leaders or executives that are in healthcare around, sort of what can we do there where, our society relies on these workers so much and they are, sort of carrying a heavy burden for sure.
Yeah. If I had a suggestion for that, I'd go over to NHS headquarters down the road and solve the problem. It's definitely challenging and it's compounded. This is a good example of where, really meaningful, purposeful work, which is healthcare for sure. It is important, but it can be a bit of a double-edged sword because of compassion fatigue, because these individuals become so dedicated and are so purpose-driven that they dedicate too much of themselves to work. And sometimes that psychological detachment, especially for individuals in healthcare, needs to happen while on the job. And so like giving individuals who work in healthcare breaks during the workday where they can actually detach from what they're doing and replenish there. And so you do see, this isn't an easy solution, but you do see many workplaces and hospitals being redesigned to have better break areas for their in-person workers. And one example would be green spaces. So building in, a lot of people are tearing up parking lots right now because they don't need the space anymore, and turn that into like a green space where people can actually detach during their workday and get to a place that there's plenty of science that shows how restorative being in a natural environment is being versus an artificial environment. And so I think that's critical. And I also think we need to take mental health as seriously as we take actual physical safety in the workplace. And so a lot of, if you go into a hospital, there are so many regulations around patient safety and around worker safety. It's one of the most safe places that you can possibly be. And if you see something unsafe, whether that's in the operating room or in the hallway, you speak up and it gets resolved fairly quickly. There's compliance, audits, and all those sorts of things. I think we need to take mental health that seriously. It needs to be where, as HR professionals, as managers, and as healthcare professionals, if you see something, you need to say something in terms of someone becoming burnt out. And when it comes to burnout, we often think of burnout as being exhaustion related. And so when we see somebody exhausted, we think they may be burning out. But exhaustion is only one sign of burnout. There's two other signs that often go unnoticed. One is cynicism. So when you see an employee who used to be really positive, and now she's developed kind of a cynical attitude toward her work, she may not be exhausted, but that's an early warning sign of burnout. And the same thing goes for a reduced sense of accomplishment or lower efficacy, where you have someone say, I made another mistake again. I just don't have it anymore. I just don't have the magic anymore. That's again a warning sign of burnout. And so I think in hospitals, not to add more work to the safety managers, but there just has to be a more serious approach taken to mental health, such that there can be an intervention when individuals are overcommitting themselves to the purpose of their work.
Such great ideas there. And I'm going to steal from the previous, manufacturing line example as well of the sabbatical, and maybe introducing the sabbatical and understanding that there are, challenges to being short-staffed and, but chicken and egg, as this question said, how do we start to create an environment that brings people back into what is a very noble profession? Last question, very easy, I think. What is the ideal number of direct reports per manager to effectively lead, in your opinion?
So it depends on what else is on that manager's plate, but and I'm going to give a non-science-backed answer, so I'll just throw that out. But I think probably 5 is a good number. And again, I just want you to think about the best relationships that you have in your life and how much work you put into them, and then say, how much can I do that in the workplace? And the number is probably pretty low. But I bet there's a number of people in the audience who have wonderful rules of thumb that are probably pretty good as well. But my non-scientific answer that strikes me as accurate is probably 5. But often as management professors, we answer with "it depends," and so I'll throw that in as well.
Yeah, a handful, definitely. And a handful could be, sort of, 2 hands or 1 hand, but it's a handful. It's not, dozens for sure. Okay, Sabina, we're going to turn it back over to you. Anthony, thank you so much for so many great comments. We look forward to answering the questions that were asked in the chat or in the Q&A, but I'll turn it over to Sabina to wrap us up on time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Klotz and Sue, for joining us today. On behalf of Betterworks and our presenters, we would like to thank you all for attending, responding to the Great Resignation and shaping the future of work. We would love to invite you all to our Make Work Better Summit, which is happening on October 19th. We will be featuring industry leader Ryan Estes as our keynote speaker. And we would love to invite you to our next People Fundamentals webinar with Lindsay Pollock, The Remix, How to Lead and Succeed in the Multi-Generational Workplace. Please visit betterworks.com to register for these other events. We'd love to have you guys all come back and have a great rest of your day.